Judy Garland was reduced to singing for pennies in back-alley nightclubs, slipping off stage to face hotel managers pounding for rent, while IRS agents and creditors circled like vultures. Errol Flynn's millions bled away on liquor and lawyers, and Dorothy Dandridge's account closed with just 24 cents. These are 17 Hollywood legends who died broke, undone by taxes, their own vices, and the cruel collapse of fortune. Number 1. Judy Garland, the girl who couldn't buy a rainbow. The stage lights flickered across her pale face as she sang in a smoky London nightclub in 1969. Once the highest-paid singer at MGM, Judy Garland now performed for pocket change, her trembling voice carrying more sorrow than song. She slipped off stage some nights only to face hotel managers demanding bills she could not pay. The woman who had once been America's sweetheart was now dodging creditors, estranged husbands, and her own failing health. Garland's rise had been the stuff of legend. In 1939, she gave the world The Wizard of Oz, and MGM cashed in on her girl-next-door image through the 1940s. She was paired with Mickey Rooney in cheerful musicals and serenaded wartime audiences with Meet Me in St. Louis, 1944. The studios earned millions, and she earned millions more. But behind the Technicolor glamour, contracts were written in the studio's favor, and Judy was left with little power over her own fortune. Her downfall came not in one dramatic crash, but through 1,000 small betrayals. She married 5 times. Husbands and managers drained her accounts with failed ventures. Sid Luft, her third husband, burned through her earnings on reckless investments and personal indulgence. By the late 1950s, Garland owed the IRS millions in back taxes. Newspapers whispered that agents were circling, ready to seize her home, yet she fought to stay in the spotlight. In 1961, she returned with Judy at Carnegie Hall, an electrifying triumph that won Grammys and seemed to restore her glory. But even that paycheck vanished into the black hole of debts and medical bills. She was reduced to accepting cabaret bookings in small venues across Europe, clutching microphones while her finances collapsed further. On June 22, 1969, Judy Garland died in a modest London townhouse at just 47 years old. Her estate was valued at a mere $40,000, while her debts soared past $4 million. For a woman who had once embodied Hollywood's golden promise, the irony was devastating. She had sung of rainbows, but in the end, she could not buy one. Number 2. Errol Flynn, Robin Hood, robbed by himself. The nightclubs of Havana knew him as well as Hollywood did. By the 1950s, Errol Flynn was staggering through smoky backrooms, a glass in one hand and an unpaid bill in the other. He once owned yachts the size of mansions, estates overlooking the Pacific, and wardrobes fit for a prince. But creditors were circling, former lovers sued for support, and the IRS waited like vultures. The swashbuckler who stole hearts as Robin Hood now struggled to pay for his own bar tab. Flynn's rise had been meteoric. Captain Blood, 1935, launched him from obscurity into Warner Brothers' Golden Boy. And The Adventures of Robin Hood, 1938, sealed his immortality. Audiences adored his devilish grin, his swordplay, his effortless charm. On screen, he was the people's hero. Off-screen, he played the role too well. Only this time, he was robbing himself. Mansions in Hollywood Hills, private islands, yachts anchored off Jamaica, and endless parties consumed his earnings faster than Warner could pay him. The scandals came like rolling thunder. In 1943, Flynn was dragged into a highly publicized trial, accused of misconduct with underage girls. Though acquitted, the proceedings humiliated him and drained his fortune in legal fees. Gossip columnists turned his private life into lurid headlines, chronicling his affairs and his extravagant spending. The matinee idol's reputation never fully recovered, and in a business obsessed with image, that meant fewer lucrative roles. By the late 1950s, Flynn's health faltered. Years of excess left his body ravaged. But he clung to the camera, appearing in low-budget films far beneath his talent simply to pay debts. His final years were spent drifting from one failed scheme to another, borrowing money against the legend of his own name. On October 14, 1959, Errol Flynn collapsed in Vancouver at just 50 years old. His estate was valued at a mere $10,000, a fortune reduced to ashes. Hollywood had crowned him its greatest adventurer, but he died a man conquered by his own appetites. The cruel irony was clear. Robin Hood could steal from the rich and give to the poor, but Errol Flynn only managed to steal from himself. Number 3. Dorothy Dandridge, Hollywood's barrier breaker, with 24 cents left. When her manager found her in her modest West Hollywood apartment in 1965, the most shocking detail wasn't only her lifeless body. It was the bank slip that showed she had just 24 cents to her name. Dorothy Dandridge, once draped in gowns on the Carmen Jones, 1954, red carpet, had been reduced to counting pennies in her final days. Hollywood's first black leading lady was left abandoned by the very industry that had once promised her the world. In the mid-1950s, Dorothy was at her peak. Her fiery performance in Carmen Jones made her the first African-American woman nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actress. She sang with Harry Belafonte, dazzled audiences in smoky clubs, and headlined at the Apollo. Studios like 20th Century Fox promoted her as a symbol of progress. Yet behind the posters and premieres, opportunities were quietly closing. Roles worthy of her talent never materialized. The same Hollywood that made her a pioneer also built a glass ceiling she could never break through. The cracks spread into her private life. 2 failed marriages drained her emotionally and financially. Her first husband, Harold Nicholas of the famed Nicholas brothers, left her struggling to provide for their disabled daughter, whose medical expenses mounted. Her second husband, Jack Dennison, squandered what remained of her fortune on failed business ventures, leaving Dorothy with IRS debts she could never repay. Gossip columns hinted at romances with white leading men, but those headlines only brought more scrutiny and fewer offers from cautious studios. By 1963, Dorothy declared bankruptcy, crushed beneath $150,000 in unpaid taxes and bad investments. No studio came to rescue her. Instead, she was left booking nightclub shows in Las Vegas, her voice trembling with the weight of exhaustion. On September 8, 1965, Dorothy Dandridge was discovered in that small apartment, just 42 years old. The official cause was a fatal mix of pills, but the deeper truth was betrayal. By lovers, by the system, by Hollywood itself. The woman who once stood on Oscar's stage with history at her back died with less than the price of a bus fare in her pocket. Number 4. Barbara Payton, the starlet who sold herself to survive. By the mid-1960s, Barbara Payton could be found wandering Hollywood Boulevard with mascara smudged, her once radiant face unrecognizable to the fans who had once cheered her. She scribbled bad checks for meals, spent nights in cheap hotels she couldn't afford, and when all else failed, she resorted to selling herself on the very streets that had once hosted her premieres. It was a grotesque reversal. A Warner Brothers starlet reduced to a ghost in the city she had once conquered. Her beginning had promised the opposite. In 1950, Payton shared the screen with James Cagney in Kiss Tomorrow, Goodbye, her sultry performance hinting at a glittering career ahead. Studios and gossip columnists dubbed her the next big thing. She was young, blonde, and armed with that dangerous magnetism that made audiences lean in. Hollywood offered her the world, but it came with conditions, and Barbara never played by their rules. The scandals started early. She juggled high-profile romances with actors like Franchot Tone and Tom Neal, relationships that turned violent and tabloid-worthy. One infamous 1951 brawl between Tone and Neal left Tone hospitalized with a shattered cheekbone. and Barbara's reputation shattered with it. Warner Brothers executives, wary of the headlines, began distancing themselves. Roles vanished as fast as her bank account. With offers gone, Barbara drifted into alcohol-fueled nights and reckless decisions. Arrests for public drunkenness made headlines. Unpaid debts turned into court appearances. By her mid-30s, the woman once draped in satin gowns was living in squalor, relying on the few dollars she could scrape together from odd encounters and fading notoriety. Friends avoided her, agents abandoned her, and the gossip columns that once crowned her now mocked her downfall. On May 8, 1967, Barbara Payton died in her parents' modest home in San Diego, just 39 years old. Years of hard drinking had ravaged her body, leaving her with heart and liver failure. There was no Hollywood funeral, no studio tribute, no grand send-off, only a quiet cremation for a woman who had once burned so brightly. She kissed tomorrow goodbye on screen. And in life, tomorrow never came. Number 5. Fatty Arbuckle. $1 million a year to nothing. In September 1921, San Francisco hotel corridors echoed with whispers of scandal. Police hauled Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle into custody. The most famous funny man in America, suddenly branded a villain. Newspapers plastered his face beneath headlines screaming of misconduct and ruin. Within days, Paramount suspended its prized clown, and by the end of the year, audiences who had once roared with laughter now turned their backs. The man who earned over $1 million a year was suddenly begging for the chance to work again. Arbuckle's rise had been staggering. In the 1910s, he reigned alongside Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, his round face and agile slapstick defying gravity, in shorts like Fatty and Mabel Adrift, 1916. By 1920, Paramount signed him to a staggering 3-year contract worth $3 million, the highest in Hollywood. Crowds adored him. He was the gentle giant, the life of every reel, the star who could turn a custard pie into pure art. Then came the scandal that destroyed him. At a wild party in September 1921, actress Virginia Rappe collapsed, later dying of internal injuries. Though Arbuckle insisted on his innocence, prosecutors accused him of misconduct, dragging him through not one, but 3 sensational trials. The press devoured every detail, fanning outrage. Though ultimately acquitted in 1922, the damage was irreversible. Studios banned his films, theater owners pulled his comedies, and he was blacklisted from the industry that once worshipped him. The legal bills alone drained him. Over $700,000 spent on his defense, wiping out years of fortune. He tried to claw his way back, directing under the pseudonym William Goodrich and scraping together modest paychecks. But the glory days never returned. Hollywood, ever fearful of scandal, kept its doors locked. By June 29, 1933, Arbuckle's once mighty name was a hushed, cautionary tale. He died of a heart attack at just 46, living modestly and still burdened by debts. There were no million-dollar contracts now, no red carpet parades, only the echo of laughter that had turned into silence. The cruelest punchline of all, America's favorite clown was left penniless, a millionaire undone not by his art, but by the shadows Hollywood never forgave. Number 6. Buster Keaton, the stone face who laughed through ruin. By the early 1930s, Buster Keaton was sneaking into MGM offices not to pitch a film, but to plead for money. The man who once commanded the screen in The General, 1926, was now an employee stripped of creative control, his genius stifled by studio contracts. He had lost his fortune, his freedom, and even his marriage. America's great stone face, who never cracked a smile in front of the camera, was cracking apart behind the scenes. Keaton's legacy seemed untouchable in the silent era. With daredevil stunts that defied physics, he had built classics like Sherlock Jr., 1924, and Steamboat Bill, Jr., 1928. cementing his reputation as Chaplin's equal and a pioneer of physical comedy. But when sound arrived, MGM snatched him up and smothered him. Executives dictated scripts, neutered his creativity, and forced him into formulaic comedies. The brilliance that had once dazzled audiences became a shadow of itself. The losses piled higher. In 1932, his divorce from Natalie Talmadge gutted his finances, leaving him with little more than the clothes on his back. Court settlements took much of what the Depression hadn't already stripped away. Friends whispered about nights where Keaton, unable to cope, couldn't put down the bottle, stumbling through bars that once cheered his name. Arrests for disorderly conduct added humiliation to injury. Hollywood's great innovator was now tabloid fodder, a cautionary tale of squandered glory. By the late 1930s, Keaton was bankrupt, his career in ruins, reduced to gag writing for other comedians to pay the bills. Yet even in those darkest years, he carried himself with quiet resilience. The comeback came slowly. Television appearances in the 1950s, cameos in films like Sunset Boulevard, 1950, and commercials that reminded the world of his timeless face. Though the grand paychecks never returned, he found modest stability and the respect of a younger generation of filmmakers who hailed him as a master. When Buster Keaton died in 1966, he left behind no great fortune, only a modest home and the echo of laughter that still reverberates through film history. Hollywood had tried to bury his brilliance, but irony remained. The stone face who lived through ruin never lost his ability to move audiences without a single word. Number 7. Veronica Lake. Peekaboo hair, empty pockets. By the late 1960s, Veronica Lake could be found behind the counter of a shabby New York hotel, pouring coffee for businessmen who barely noticed her. Few realized that this weary waitress was once the woman whose peekaboo hairstyle had stopped traffic during the 1940s, copied by millions of women across America. The star who had glided through Paramount sound stages in satin gowns was now scrubbing tables, her glamour traded for anonymity. Hollywood had forgotten her, and her fortune had vanished with it. Lake's rise was swift and dazzling. In Sullivan's Travels, 1941, and This Gun for Hire, 1942, she embodied the archetypal femme fatale, cool, mysterious, and impossible to ignore. Paramount promoted her as their answer to Lauren Bacall, and for a time she was one of the most bankable actresses of the World War II era. Her hairstyle became so iconic that even the U.S. government stepped in, urging her to change it during the war, because factory women copying her look risked accidents on the assembly line. She was more than a star. She was a cultural phenomenon, but success soured quickly. Her reputation for being difficult on set alienated directors and co-stars. Behind the studio gloss, she battled personal demons, and alcohol became her constant companion. Failed marriages compounded the chaos, draining her finances and fracturing her stability. By the early 1950s, Paramount cut ties, and the woman once headlining premieres was now blacklisted from the major studios. Her decline grew more visible with each year. Bankruptcy was declared in 1951, her assets stripped away. The gossip pages that once celebrated her beauty now chronicled her arrests for disorderly conduct and unpaid debts. By the 1960s, Veronica Lake was eking out a living in low-paying jobs, a far cry from the days when she lit up screens beside Alan Ladd. She died in 1973, only 50 years old, in a small Vermont hospital, suffering from hepatitis and kidney failure. At her death, she had little more than a modest bank account and a few personal belongings. The irony was cruel. A woman who defined glamour in the 1940s left this world with nothing but memories of a hairstyle that once belonged to every woman, and a fortune that slipped through her fingers. Number 8. Bela Lugosi. Dracula's coffin was empty too. When Bela Lugosi died in 1956, He was buried in his Dracula cape, yet the coffin was nearly as empty as his bank account. The man who had terrified audiences in 1931's Dracula left behind just $1,900 in cash and a handful of personal belongings. His debts were so severe that Frank Sinatra quietly stepped in to pay for the funeral. The king of horror had become a pauper, undone not by vampires, but by Hollywood's cruelty and his own personal demons. Lugosi's fame was born in shadows. His haunting accent and hypnotic stare defined Universal's golden age of horror, making Dracula, 1931, a cultural landmark that still chills audiences today. He followed it with roles in Murders in the Rue Morgue, 1932, and White Zombie, 1932, becoming the face of cinematic nightmares. But with every success came a curse: typecasting. Studios locked him into horror parts, while contemporaries like Boris Karloff secured richer, more varied roles. Resentment grew, and so did the bills. By the 1940s, Lugosi's career was in free fall. He was reduced to working in low-budget productions, Poverty Row pictures that paid a fraction of what he once commanded. In private, he battled chronic sciatica, a pain so severe that doctors prescribed morphine. Soon, he couldn't put down the needle, and addiction became another chain dragging him under. His finances crumbled with each passing year, until in 1955, he filed for bankruptcy, listing just a few $1,000s in assets and debts that outweighed them. Still, the proud actor refused to let go of his cape. He accepted bit parts in Ed Wood's low-rent productions, films so cheap they were mocked even then. Yet, Lugosi performed with dignity, even as Hollywood snickered. Neighbors whispered about his frail frame and haunted eyes, a man once larger than life, now reduced to desperation. On August 16, 1956, Bela Lugosi's heart gave out in Los Angeles. He was 73. At his funeral, mourners saw him lying in the black cloak of Dracula, as though he had stepped out of one last scene. But behind the Gothic image was a tragedy. The immortal Count, who gave Hollywood one of its most enduring icons, died bankrupt, reliant on the kindness of others to grant him a final resting place. Number 9. John Gilbert, the talkie victim. MGM let die penniless. By 1930, John Gilbert was pacing his dressing room, hearing the cruelest rumor an actor could face: that his voice was a joke. Projectionists whispered that MGM had deliberately tampered with his sound tests, making his dialogue shrill and unfit for the new era of talking pictures. For a man once hailed as the great lover of the silent screen, the humiliation was unbearable. The matinee idol, who had commanded million-dollar contracts, was suddenly branded obsolete, and the studio that had built him seemed eager to watch him fall. In the 1920s, Gilbert was box office royalty. Films like Flesh and the Devil, 1926, with Greta Garbo, made him a household name, their on-screen chemistry sparking one of Hollywood's most talked-about romances. He signed a record-breaking contract with MGM, rivaling Rudolph Valentino as the era's greatest romantic star. Fans swooned, gossip columnists chronicled his affairs, and Gilbert's fortune flowed like champagne at the Coconut Grove. But when sound arrived, the empire cracked. Gilbert's first talking role in His Glorious Night, 1929, was met with snickers. Lines like, "I love you, I love you, I love you," delivered in a voice the press claimed was too high, too thin, drew laughter instead of passion. Insiders whispered that MGM chief Louis B. Mayer, who despised Gilbert, orchestrated the sabotage, giving him poor scripts and refusing to protect his image. Whether true or not, the damage was done. Gilbert's finances unraveled just as quickly as his career. Divorces, extravagant spending, and shrinking contracts drained his wealth. By the early 1930s, he was reduced to minor roles, his former stardom a fading memory. Alcohol became his refuge, a slow escape from the humiliation of a world that had once adored him. Hollywood, which once dressed him in silk and spotlight, now shut its gates. On January 9, 1936, John Gilbert died of a heart attack at just 36 years old. He left behind little money, only broken contracts and fading clippings of his glory days. For a man who once rivaled Valentino, the irony was tragic. Hollywood's great lover was abandoned by love itself, betrayed by the sound of his own voice. Number 10. John Garfield, blacklisted to death. On a spring night in 1952, John Garfield clutched his chest in a New York apartment and collapsed before he ever reached the bed. He was only 39, a man once courted by Warner Brothers for every gritty, streetwise role they could throw at him. Yet by then, he had no studio, no contracts, and little money left. The blacklist, that cold, bureaucratic word, had stripped him of everything. Garfield's ascent had been meteoric. With The Postman Always Rings Twice, 1946, and Body and Soul, 1947, he electrified audiences, pioneering a raw, naturalistic style that would later be called method acting. He was the working-class hero, the scrappy kid from the Bronx who made good. Warner Brothers promoted him as a new kind of leading man, one who could bring sweat, anger, and desire to the screen. In the late 1940s, he was one of Hollywood's most bankable stars and one of its most outspoken. That outspokenness became his downfall. As the Red Scare gripped America, Garfield refused to play by Washington's script. When summoned by the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1951, he denied being a communist, but also refused to name names. Studios saw him as radioactive. Projects evaporated overnight. Even friends avoided him, afraid of being tainted by association. The financial collapse came fast. With contracts canceled, Garfield's steady stream of income dried up. Legal bills mounted. Gossip columnists branded him a traitor, and producers quietly blacklisted him. He retreated to New York, scraping together theater work while his Hollywood mansions and million-dollar paychecks became bitter memories. The pressure crushed him. Friends recalled his hands trembling, his face prematurely lined with exhaustion. On May 21, 1952, Garfield's heart gave out after a long day of testimony and tension. He died in the apartment of a friend, a lonely end for a man once hailed as the voice of America's streets. At his funeral, mourners whispered about the cruelty of it all. Hollywood had adored his realism, only to exile him for refusing to play pretend in front of Congress. John Garfield, the boy from the Bronx who gave Hollywood grit, was blacklisted to death. Number 11. Frances Farmer, studio rebel left to shadows. In 1943, Frances Farmer was dragged out of a Los Angeles courtroom, her wrists bound, her screams echoing as reporters snapped photographs. The once celebrated actress who had shared the screen in Come and Get It, 1936, and Rhythm on the Range, 1936, was now branded Hollywood's bad girl. What began as whispers of rebellion, refusing studio makeovers, mocking gossip columnists, rejecting contracts, had spiraled into a public breakdown that studios eagerly capitalized on. Frances wasn't just punished by the law, she was exiled by Hollywood itself. At her peak, Farmer was a striking presence. Tall, intelligent, and fiercely independent, she refused to play the docile starlet MGM and Paramount expected. She turned heads in Howard Hawks' Come and Get It, where critics hailed her as one of the brightest talents of the decade. But her refusal to conform, her biting wit in interviews, and her public clashes with studio executives made her enemies. While other actresses curried favor, Frances fought the system, and the system fought back. The dissent came quickly. Arrests for drunken driving and disorderly conduct filled the headlines by the early 1940s, each one splashed across gossip pages with mocking headlines. In 1943, a courtroom outburst ended with her being committed to psychiatric institutions. There, reports swirled of harsh treatments, from heavy sedation to electroshock, painting a grim picture of a woman broken more by the institutions than by her own mind. Financially, the collapse was devastating. Her once substantial contracts evaporated, her properties sold off to cover legal bills and medical costs. By the time she was released from institutional care in the late 1940s, Hollywood had moved on without her. Farmer's attempts at comebacks, regional theater, occasional television appearances never brought back her wealth or status. She spent her final years quietly in Indianapolis, far from the bright lights she once defied. When Frances Farmer died of cancer in 1970, at just 56, there was no great Hollywood tribute. Her fortune was gone, her name tarnished, her legacy buried under scandal and silence. The irony was bitter. The woman who fought hardest for independence in a ruthless system was remembered not for her brilliance, but for her downfall. Number 12. Billie Holiday, the lady who sang the blues broke. When Billie Holiday lay dying in a New York hospital bed in 1959, federal agents stood watch outside her door, ready to arrest her even as machines kept her alive. The IRS had already seized nearly everything she owned, and when the end came, she had only $750 to her name. The voice that had given the world Strange Fruit and God Bless the Child was silenced, not by applause, but by poverty and betrayal. Holiday's rise was nothing short of miraculous. In the 1930s and 40s, she was the smoky-voiced queen of Harlem's Cotton Club, later touring with Count Basie and Artie Shaw. She shattered barriers as one of the first black women to perform with a white orchestra, her renditions of Loverman and Fine and Mellow becoming standards. Her phrasing and raw emotional delivery influenced generations of singers, from Frank Sinatra to Nina Simone. But behind the velvet voice was a woman constantly fighting against racism, against ruthless managers, and against the government itself. The betrayals came from every direction. Record labels exploited her, paying pennies compared to the wealth her records generated. Nightclubs demanded she enter through back doors, even as audiences lined up to hear her sing. The press branded her difficult. Gossip columnists chronicled her courtroom battles, and the IRS circled like sharks. She turned to drink and narcotics to numb the pain, and by the late 1940s, arrests for possession gave authorities the weapon they needed to strip her of her cabaret license. No license meant no legal work in the clubs where she had built her name. Financial ruin followed. Medical bills, unpaid taxes, and years of mismanagement left her destitute. Friends recalled her pawning furs and jewelry just to keep afloat. By the end of her life, Holiday's once commanding voice had grown fragile, but when she sang, it still carried the weight of every heartbreak. Billie Holiday died on July 17, 1959, at just 44 years old. She was guarded like a criminal, broke in both body and bank account. The bitter irony was unmistakable. The woman who gave America its most haunting songs about suffering died with the blues written across her own life. Number 13. Mabel Normand, comedy queen in a sanitarium. In 1922, Hollywood headlines screamed her name, not for laughter, but for murder. When director William Desmond Taylor was found dead in his Los Angeles bungalow, the last person seen with him was Mabel Normand. Though never charged, her reputation was blackened overnight. The beloved comedian, once Chaplin's equal in box office draw, was now whispered about in smoke-filled speakeasies as the woman tied to scandal and ruin. Normand had been one of the brightest lights of the silent era. With her mischievous grin and boundless energy, she starred in keystone comedies like Mabel's Strange Predicament, 1914, where she introduced audiences to a young Charlie Chaplin and his famous tramp character. She headlined opposite Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle in dozens of slapstick hits. Her name splashed across posters from New York to San Francisco. For a time, she was America's sweetheart of comedy, a pioneer in an industry dominated by men. But scandal never loosened its grip. The Taylor murder case haunted her career, casting shadows over every role she played. Studios wary of moral crusaders and gossip columnists, quietly pushed her aside. Then came her own decline, a dependence on alcohol, a reputation for late-night partying, and constant press scrutiny that painted her as reckless. Behind the laughter, she was fighting battles Hollywood audiences never saw. The harshest blow came from her health. Diagnosed with tuberculosis, she spent much of the 1920s shuttling between sanitariums. Medical bills drained her wealth, while her inability to work meant the fortune she once commanded evaporated. Friends recalled her spirit dimming, the spark that once lit up silent screens reduced to a frail shadow of its former self. On February 23, 1930, Mabel Normand died at just 37 years old in a Monrovia sanitarium. Once one of the highest-paid stars of her generation, she left behind little more than fading reels of comedy shorts and a tarnished reputation. The bitter irony was undeniable. A woman who gave the world laughter spent her final years in silence. Her fortune gone, her name entangled with a scandal she could never outrun. Number 14. Sammy Davis Jr. Dancing to pay the IRS. In his final years, Sammy Davis Jr. stepped onto stages with a smile masking unbearable pain. His throat burned with cancer, his body weakened, but the IRS still demanded millions. He danced and sang not for the roar of the crowd, but to keep creditors at bay. By the time of his death in 1990, the man once celebrated as the ultimate entertainer owed more than $7 million in back taxes and left behind an estate still deep in debt. Davis had been the heartbeat of the Rat Pack. Alongside Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, he lit up Las Vegas in the 1960s, breaking color barriers in an era still shackled by segregation. Audiences thrilled to his dazzling tap routines, velvet voice, and comic timing in films like Ocean's 11, 1960. He was everywhere. Broadway, Hollywood, nightclubs, a one-man showbiz empire. His lifestyle matched the spotlight. Mansions, luxury cars, fine jewelry, and parties that rivaled Sinatra's own. For years, he seemed untouchable, but the IRS was watching. Years of excessive spending collided with poor financial management, and penalties mounted when unpaid taxes piled high. By the late 1970s, Davis's finances had crumbled. The government seized assets, and headlines blared the figure: $7 million owed. To the public, he was still the showman. Behind the curtain, he was a desperate man trying to outrun debts too large to ever pay. Even as his health collapsed in the late 1980s, Davis refused to stop performing. Friends recalled him taking the stage with a cigarette-thickened rasp, pushing through pain to deliver the songs audiences demanded. He joked with Sinatra on stage, but offstage, he confessed fears that he'd leave his family with nothing but debts. By the end, much of his fortune was gone, consumed by the taxman and years of excess. On May 16, 1990, Sammy Davis Jr. died at just 64. His legacy as the greatest entertainer in the world endured. But the final curtain revealed a cruel irony. The man who could sing, dance, and charm his way through anything couldn't escape the IRS. Sammy Davis Jr. had given everything to the stage, and the stage took everything back. Number 15. Bud Abbott. The straight man the IRS broke. In the final years of his life, Bud Abbott, once half of the most successful comedy team in America, made televised appeals asking fans for financial help. The man who had stood on stage with Lou Costello delivering the immortal routine, "Who's on first?" was now nearly penniless, his home seized by the IRS. The straight man who had set up Hollywood's biggest laughs was left to beg for mercy from an audience that once adored him. Abbott and Costello had been giants of the 1940s. Their partnership, forged in burlesque, exploded when Universal brought them to the big screen. Films like Buck Privates, 1941, and Hold That Ghost, 1941, made them box office kings. They toured tirelessly, sold out theaters, and their radio programs drew millions of listeners. During World War II, they even raised an astonishing $85 million in war bonds, cementing their place as America's comedy duo. On paper, they should have been set for life, but trouble was brewing behind the laughter. The IRS disallowed $500,000 in expenses the team claimed during their war bond tours. That ruling created a massive tax liability that ballooned over the years with penalties and interest. Add in extravagant lifestyles, expensive homes, and costly divorces, and the fortune they had built began to vanish. After Costello's death in 1959, Abbott tried performing solo, but his health, plagued by epilepsy, made steady work impossible. By the 1960s, creditors had stripped him of nearly everything. His Encino home was seized, forcing him into a modest apartment. Friends recalled him pacing at night, ashamed of the downfall, wondering how a man who made the world laugh could not afford his own medical bills. Occasionally, he would appear on television for guest spots, but they brought little more than pocket change. Bud Abbott died in 1974 at the age of 78, virtually penniless. There was no fortune left from the millions he and Costello once earned, only memories of routines replayed on late-night television. The cruel irony lingered. The straight man who had delivered the punchlines for America's greatest laughs had no punchline left for himself, only silence and debt. Number 16. Marie Prevost, a silent star devoured by obscurity. In January 1937, neighbors in a shabby Los Angeles apartment building noticed a foul odor creeping from behind a locked door. Inside, they found Marie Prevost, once Ernst Lubitsch's darling, dead at just 38. The woman who had graced premieres and champagne parties in the 1920s had wasted away alone, her body ravaged by malnutrition. On her nightstand sat an unpaid stack of bills. In her bank account, less than $300. 2 decades earlier, Prevost had seemed untouchable. She starred in Lubitsch's American debut, The Marriage Circle, 1924, and comedies like Kiss Me Again, 1925, where critics praised her as the quintessential flapper. Witty, fashionable, irresistible. She was one of Warner Brothers' sorcerers. Most reliable stars, photographed draped in furs and pearls, a picture of jazz-age glamour. But the silent era giveth, and the sound era taketh away. Her light voice and maturing looks didn't translate to talkies, and studios eager for fresh faces quietly pushed her aside. The decline was brutal. By the early 1930s, Prevost was relegated to bit parts, often uncredited, her name slipping from marquees. Desperate to maintain her figure in an industry obsessed with youth, she embraced extreme dieting, leaving her frail and ill. The gossip columns, once her allies, now mocked her fall from grace, a cruel spotlight on her fading fame. She battled personal demons in isolation, her phone ringing less and less as offers dried up. Financial ruin followed. Without steady income, her fortune evaporated into medical bills, rent, and survival. Friends abandoned her. Studios refused her calls. And in the end, she lived in near poverty, reduced to one-room apartments far removed from the Beverly Hills estates she once occupied. Marie Prevost died on January 21, 1937. Her death certificate citing malnutrition and heart failure. Hollywood barely blinked. There was no grand funeral, no lavish tributes, only a grim footnote about a once-celebrated starlet who had been left behind. The irony was crushing. The woman who embodied the carefree, flapper life of the Roaring Twenties had starved to death in obscurity, her beauty gone, her fortune vanished, her legacy reduced to a cautionary tale. Number 17. Clara Bow. The it girl who lost it all by the 1930s, Clara Bow, the woman who had once defined desire itself, was hiding in a Nevada ranch house, terrified of the press. The it girl of the Roaring Twenties, whose name alone could sell out theaters, was now bankrupt, isolated, and haunted by scandals, She could never escape. She had been America's most desired star, yet she ended her life as a recluse, stripped of her fortune and reputation. In the silent era, Clara Bow was untouchable. Her breakthrough in It, 1927, cemented her as the original It Girl, the embodiment of sex appeal and modern femininity. Audiences adored her in Wings, 1927, the first film to win Best Picture, and in comedies that captured the jazz age's reckless energy. Paramount showered her with million-dollar contracts, and gossip columnists called her the screen's hottest property. With her Brooklyn accent and flapper charm, she was the face of a generation hungry for glamour and rebellion. But fame was never kind. Studio executives exploited her, gossip rags smeared her with salacious rumors, and jealous rivals whispered about her off-screen romances. Behind the camera, Clara's family mismanaged her finances. Her father and guardians plundered her earnings, leaving her vulnerable to tax troubles and unpaid bills. By the time talkies arrived, her natural Brooklyn accent clashed with Hollywood's desire for polished sophistication. Suddenly, the It Girl seemed out of step. Her personal struggles deepened. She battled crippling anxiety, endured multiple breakdowns, and withdrew from the spotlight. By 1933, she retired completely, retreating to a Nevada ranch with her husband, cowboy actor Rex Bell. The fortune she had once amassed had evaporated through mismanagement and lawsuits. What remained was modest at best, hardly the empire she had earned in her Paramount days. Clara Bow spent her final decades in seclusion, wary of visitors and avoiding Hollywood entirely. When she died in 1965 at just 60 years old, she left behind not the legend of riches, but the legend of loss. The cruel irony was undeniable. The woman who gave America its first taste of it had everything: beauty, fame, money, except the one thing she needed most: security. Hollywood's glow was golden, but its shadows were darker. Fortunes lost, legends forgotten, dreams betrayed. These stories remind us that fame can vanish in a heartbeat. Share your thoughts below. And if you cherish these untold tales, like and subscribe so their voices are never silenced.